So before I jump right into it, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who entered the giveaway in last week's video. This was hands down the most popular giveaway I've ever done on this channel before, with over 2,500 entries to win the Denney V6 filter kit, along with the landscape circular polarizer. And I do have the winner selected that I'll announce towards the end of this video, so be sure to stick around for that. Now, when it comes to landscape photography, I don't think there's much of an argument to the fact that a wide-angle lens is by far the most popular choice of glass to start with, and rightfully so. Landscapes generally cover a large and expansive area, and it only makes sense to reach for a lens that will also capture this large area. But effectively using a wide-angle lens, it definitely comes with a unique set of challenges, especially since these ultra-wide views are such a stark departure from what we see on a daily basis with our naked eyes, which in turn makes utilizing these wide focal lengths that much trickier in certain situations. And in this video, I want to share with you the most egregious problems that I encountered when I first started to use a wide-angle lens and how best to solve for them. And I have not completely solved for each and every one of these, as some of these still creep into my workflow from time to time. Even during my most recent on-location video just last week, there was a couple of these wide-angle instant issues that crept into my workflow in that particular situation as well. So to jump right into it, the very first problem is something that I call the prime effect. So when I first got my very first wide-angle lens, it was a 16 to 35 millimeter zoom lens. And for the first 6 months, and I confirmed this by looking in Lightroom as to the focal lengths that I use for certain lenses, but for the first 6 months that I owned my first wide-angle lens, I don't think I ever even touched the zoom ring. Every single one of my images was at 16 millimeters. So in essence, it was almost like my 16 to 35 millimeter zoom lens was being used as a prime lens. And mainly because, I spent all this money on my first zoom lens or my first wide-angle lens, and I wanted to make sure that I was using it to its fullest. I wanted to capture everything. And that creates a big problem for you where you're trying to add too much information or too much items or areas of interest into your scene. And this is the image that I was alluding to earlier. This is from last week's on location video. And I really struggled with this composition. This is zoomed all the way out to 16 millimeters. But this whole area, it was a very wide scene. But the only way to make it work was to get close to these rocks in the foreground and in the outflow of the waterfall. So being able to get close to the scene and still capture everything in one image was a little bit of a struggle. And I thought about doing a 2 or 3 shot pano to capture everything, because there was another grouping of trees over here that I really liked, and I wanted to try and capture a little bit more of this area over here. And I ended up capturing this I think it was a 3 shot pano, and I stitched it all together, and it was just too much. There was just too much in the scene. And I think that's a pretty common issue, at least for me when I first started to use a wide-angle lens, and obviously when I still use it today. Here's another example right here. This is from quite a few years ago in Moab, but I think this is a very good representation of scene stuffing, if you will, just trying to put too much in the scene, because I remember I like this rock structure here, pointing to this area here, and of course the tree, and this kind of bluff or this edge of this cliff pointing out here to the canyon right through here. And there was just so much going on in the scene. It was all beautiful in its own right, but just trying to stuff it all into one composition made it a little bit trickier. And what happens a lot of times with these extreme focal lengths is not only do you try and capture everything and you just stuff the scene with so much information, a lot of times you will struggle with edge patrol, with where you're cutting things off in your scene, because if you shift a little bit too far to the left, maybe you're cutting something off on the right. And if you try and compensate and include whatever that is on the right that you were cutting off, maybe now you're cutting something off on the left as well. So being aware of how much stuff you're trying to put in the scene, and being aware of what's transpiring along the edges of your scene, not just to the left and to the right, but to the top and the bottom as well. Now, the third and final component to this prime effect has to do with negative space or empty space. And this is a good example right here. This is from Kauai, where I zoomed all the way out to 16 millimeters, and I loved the scene. Everything was great. The subtle light on the lighthouse, it all really worked. But then when I got the image home and I post-processed it, it just looked completely off balance. And I was thinking about the negative space when I was on location, but I think I just included too much of it. I was just wide open at 16 millimeters, when in essence, I probably should have just punched in a little bit to try and keep a little bit more balance. And I ended up cropping this image a little bit differently by, I think it was something more towards this effect right here, just basically removing some of that empty area over here. And in this proportion of land versus this proportion of sea and sky made the overall image feel a little bit more balanced. And I like the way that this final crop worked versus the way that it was originally done right here. So just paying attention to how much information you're putting into your composition, what's going on along your edges, and exactly what's happening with the negative space. And is the negative space working for your composition, or is it working against your composition? And probably the best advice I've ever heard with regards to this is what you exclude in your frame is just as important as what you include in your frame, and that photography is an exclusionary art. And I'm always thinking about that when I'm on location, and it definitely helps me to figure out if this should be in the frame, is it adding to the composition, or is this particular item detracting from the composition? So that definitely helps me out a lot. Now, the second problem that I used to encounter is something that I call flatline. And what flatline is basically when everything in your scene is the same distance away from your camera. Now, a lot of times if you're using a telephoto lens, you can get away with this. But when you're using a wide angle lens, it becomes a little bit trickier. And this is a good example right here. This is inside the Haleakala crater, and this is shot with a wide angle lens, and everything is basically the same distance away from my lens, and this overall image looks very flat. But if I zoom out a little bit more, and I'm able to capture this area right through here, let me just put this back on library mode, this adds a lot more depth, and it makes the overall image not look quite as flat as it did before. Here's another good example right here. This is also from last week's video where the waterfall, it's just, there's really nothing in the foreground. Everything in this image right now is, for the most part, the exact same distance away from my lens. And the overall image, it does look a little bit flat. But if I just zoom out a little bit and I kind of took a few steps back, I was able to capture a little bit more of the outflow of the waterfall and these two trees right here and this area of trees right through here. And it just creates a little bit more three-dimensional look to this overall image, and it doesn't have that just overall flat look to it. Here's one more good example right here. This is an image from quite a few years ago, but I think it's a great illustration of this flatline effect, where just putting anything in the foreground to just frame up your overall subject, just to kind of create a little bit of depth in the overall image, just so that the overall photograph doesn't feel so flat. So whenever you're using a wide angle lens, just being very aware of where things are in relation to your lens. And if everything in your photograph is the same distance away from your lens, then you might want to try and recompose it in a slightly different way, just to create some depth in your overall image, or to put some additional layers in your overall composition. Now, the second component to flatline has to do with the overall orientation that you're shooting in. When I first got my first wide angle lens, everything that I shot was in a horizontal orientation. I very rarely ever flipped my camera into a portrait orientation or a vertical orientation. And whenever you do that, you're able to capture so much more of your real estate in your frame with a wide angle lens. This is a good example right here, where this is a very tall waterfall. And being able to get this close to the waterfall in a vertical orientation with a wide angle lens enabled me to capture everything and kind of frame the falling water right between these two trees. But utilizing that vertical orientation, here's another example right here where I was able to capture, the water retreating, this little wave right here in the midground, and then of course the sea stack and the bird on the very top in the background and in the sky. If I wasn't in a vertical orientation, it would have been difficult to capture all of this from the bottom to the top of the frame and everything in its totality. So not always shooting everything in a horizontal fashion with a wide angle lens is definitely something that helped me out a lot. I have another example right here where if I put this in a horizontal orientation, it would have, I guess the overall image probably would have been somewhere right through here and up through here. But being able to capture all of this seaweed leading up to this rock right here, and then the color in the sky with the trees and the cliff, it gave a lot more top-down real estate by flipping my camera into a vertical orientation. That's definitely something that I would highly recommend doing. I think I shot for maybe 6 or 8 months, and everything was zoomed out at 16 millimeters, and everything was also in a horizontal orientation. So focusing on those kind of near to far compositions by flipping your camera in a portrait orientation is definitely a good practice to get into. Now, the third and final problem that I used to encounter a lot is something that I call resisting distortion. And what this basically means is, I think the term distortion has a real negative connotation to it, especially in the world of photography and when it has to do with lenses. Whenever we hear distortion, we're like, "Ooh, that's negative, that's bad." We don't want any kind of distortion. And if we do get distortion, we want to make sure we solve for it in post-processing. And I do think that there are certain types of distortion that should be removed. You know, if you're doing real estate or architecture type of photography and you need those really straight lines and you're using an ultra wide lens, yeah, you definitely probably want to fix those types of distortion. Or if you're shooting in a woodland scene and your trees are converging or maybe diverging, sometimes that looks cool, but a lot of times you might want those trees to be straight in your frame. But there is one type of distortion that I think should really be embraced when it comes to a wide angle lens. And always shooting at eye level was something that I used to struggle with in all genres of photography, but especially when it came to a wide angle lens. And this is a good example of when I started to get a little bit lower. So just getting lower to the water that's coming out through here, I was able to use some of that wide angle distortion, because a wide angle lens will naturally make anything that's close to its lens and that's close to the lens much bigger in the frame than it really is in real life. So getting a little bit lower and not shooting at eye level, this water looked a lot bigger than it was in real life, and these rocks in the foreground actually look a little bit bigger as well. Here's another good example right here. We're just getting very low and close to this subject right here, this log. This log looks gigantic, but in actuality, it was just kind of like a pretty small tree. It almost looked like a large limb leaning across this other log at this waterfall. But getting low and getting close, I think that's great advice. And those are two things that I never used to do when I first got a wide angle lens. Everything was at eye level, and I wasn't getting low or close to anything at all. But once I started to kind of drop the tripod and move a little bit closer to things in my foreground, I really saw a big improvement in my overall compositions. Here's another good example right here, where just not keeping your distance, getting close to things. So whatever's in your foreground, this little patch of grass right here was much smaller than it looks in this image right now. It looks substantially larger, but getting down low and getting close really anchored this photograph and just kind of draws the viewer up into the arch in the background. Here is another example right here. What I love about this scene is this scene looks a lot more grand in this image than it was in real life. This was just a small little, tiny little babbling brook. I think this overall waterfall was maybe just a couple inches. It wasn't even considered a waterfall. It was just a tiny little stream. But getting really, really close to it with a wide angle lens just made the overall scene seem much larger. And this rock right here in the foreground, this was just a tiny little rock, but I mean, this thing looks like it weighs over 100 pounds right here. So just getting up close and personal and low using a wide angle lens is a fantastic best practice to get into. And it's something that I think kind of held me back from my wide angle photography when I first started to use a wide angle lens. Now, the final component to this resisting distortion has to do with focus stacking. I think focus stacking was one of those big aha moments for me that really changed my photography. And whenever you're using a wide angle lens and you start to get low and close to objects, you might have to start focus stacking a little bit. And I made a video on this not too long ago, which I'll link above here if you want to take a look at that. But here's a good example of a focus stacked image. You know, this image, I had to get very close to this cactus right here in the foreground, which made it look much larger than it really was in real life. But the only way to get this entire image in focus was to focus stack it by just focusing on multiple different parts of the scene and combining everything later in Photoshop. Here is one more final example right here, where these rocks in the foreground are substantially larger in this image than they are in real life, just by getting much closer to them. But this is also a focus stacked image as well. It was the only way to get everything in sharp focus from front to the back. So those are the three, the biggest issues that I encountered, and all of them plagued me. Well, some of them still continue to plague me still to this day, but solving all of those really helped to improve my wide angle photography. At least I think it did. And I just knowing what I know now, I think I could have improved or resolved a lot of those issues much sooner if I'd know now what I didn't know then. Is that the same? You get what I'm saying. But I do hope that was helpful. Now, as far as the giveaway is concerned, like I mentioned, over 2,500 entries to win the Denney V6 filter kit and landscape circular polarizer, which absolutely blew me away. So thank you so much for that. And I do have the winner selected. Let me pull it up right here. And the winner of the filter kit and the landscape circular polarizer is a gentleman by the name of and I hope I don't mess up your name, but this gentleman's name is Kyle Russo. Kyle, I hope I didn't mess up your name, but you are the winner. Congratulations. Get in touch with me on Instagram. That's usually the best way. And let me know exactly where Nissy should send out your winning prize. And I'll make sure that that gets out there to you ASAP. So I do hope you enjoy this week's video. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and ring the bell notification, just that way you're notified next time I do upload. And subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.